Well, thank you all. Glad to be here. I wanted to organize this panel because as we spend a lot of time talking about open data and open source software and open solutions, we don't often spend a lot of time talking about all the challenges that we encounter as we do research and development and engineering and analysis to solve some of the hard problems around human security. So we assembled this panel. We have a diverse set of institutions and a diverse set of perspectives to talk about those challenges. I'm Carter Christopher. I lead our Human Dynamics Research and Development section at Oak Ridge. And we spend our days in this fight to publish data, to do research, and to help our federal partners address human security concerns. And so excited to moderate this panel, and I'm going to let each of our panelists introduce themselves briefly. Lisa.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Lisa Colson. I'm with the USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service, and so we focus on the rest of the world. I have a geography degree from George Washington University. If anyone else is out there with us, hello. And, and I generally am working on trade and ag maps, a lot of training activities, and moving one of our geospatial applications forward and with enhancements for GADIS, and I'll talk about it more later, but that's a bit about me. Nathaniel?
So hi, I'm Dan Runfola. I'm a professor down at William & Mary. I also moonlight as an evaluator for the United Nations FAO, the Global Environment Facility on climate-related topics, and was a contributing author to the most recent IPCC report. My background is largely in geography, a lot of satellite imagery analysis, and also big data analytics as they interrelate with GIS. Most recently, I founded the data science program down at William & Mary.
Hi everyone, my name is Caitlin Howarth. I'm the current Director of Operations for the Conflict Observatory team at Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab. We're focusing currently on the Ukraine conflict. My previous work has focused, I'm a little bit more of a generalist, so I have mainly specialized on mass atrocity dynamics across various genocides, different war contexts, everything from Sudan, South Sudan, really more broadly across the Horn of Africa, but I've also done previous work on Ukraine and have also done a fair amount, including co-authoring the Signal Code and doing some fair amount of research on the ethics of the use of big data and technology in humanitarian crises and human security threats.
Awesome, thank you. So as a first question to get the conversation going, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give us a brief overview of the types of human security problems you work with or work on in your institution, and how does that work intersect with the open ecosystems we've been talking about today so far? Lisa, you want to go first?
Well, I would imagine what we work on is a little unique in comparison to the other panelists today. So the Foreign Agricultural Service focuses on food security. And as an agency, we touch all of the different elements of food security. But I'm with a group that, have you heard of the 4 pillars of food security? We got availability, access, utilization, and stability. So it's the first pillar, availability, that my group focuses on. That's looking at the supply side of food. And so I'm with the International Production Assessment Division, and we assess crop production, provide monthly estimates of area, yield, and production for all of your major crop-producing countries around the world, focused on grains, oilseeds, and cotton for our group. Other parts of FAS look at other agricultural commodities. We're doing the big traded field crops. So, we've been doing this a long time. I really enjoyed Peter Doucette's presentation. He was talking about the 50 years of Landsat, and one of my colleagues that I was working with, she has since retired, but she used to talk about how they would use punch cards to interpret Landsat imagery. So we've been doing this a long time, and maintaining that consistent reporting on the availability of food is how we hope to help support food security.
One of my PhD advisors in 2008 made us do Landsat analysis with punch cards. It was miserable. I never want to do it again. So when we think about kind of security and the implications, a lot of my background and how that interrelates is with climate security. So that's a very broad definition of human security. When we think about it, that can be anything from resilience, right, ability to bounce back after an event occurs, to sensitivity, right, the likelihood that your livelihood will be vulnerable in the first place. One of the really cool things that I get to do that's probably unique relative to many of you in the audience and also on the stage is I get to see the use of open geospatial data on the front end when we're still talking about basic research problems and really new and innovative approaches to how we can measure different attributes of human security and vulnerability, things that we haven't seen before. We talked a little bit about deep learning and land cover classification, and one of the things that the PhD students joke about in my lab today is how land cover classification is so last decade, right? And now we're looking at what other types of information can we extract from satellite imagery? Can we take advantage of the fact that some schools look rich and some schools look poor to figure out where educated populations are living in countries we don't have that data, right? There's all sorts of information that we can start to test and do new things with. But the only reason we get to do that is because there's amazing open geospatial data sets that we can use to test all of these different crazy hypotheses. So I'm very excited about kind of the future of being able to measure and map human capacity in ways that we haven't been able to do before.
That's such a good point, and I think one of the things we're excited to see evolving is the increased conversation and new utilization of, say, indigenous practice and incorporating that just even into breaking open concepts of how we tag and classify just space and how we're conceptualizing land and boundaries, which could not be more important when you also apply the geopolitical ramifications of that, especially in a conflict space. So for our part, when we're looking at all of this in a human security and conflict context, we are, the whole premise of the Conflict Observatory and indeed for the Humanitarian Research Lab is to work with open data. So I would say that, if you want to think about the ramifications for all of the different types of applications you all are working on, I sort of represent the sponge. We are trying to soak up everything possible that we can and find an application, a use case, if not today. I mean, I can't tell. If you think that you have a lot of tabs open, boy, howdy, do I. If it's not something that I've used today, it is something that I will bookmark and save and probably use in a year, in 5 years. We never forget. And we want to come back and figure out a collaboration at some point, because there's always a way, there's always a use case whose time is going to come. And we always want to make sure that we figure out how to get that combination of timing and application correct, so that not only can we use the data ethically, but that we can use it in a fit-for-purpose way. There's also, of course, those really important complications. I think you've been talking a lot about OpenStreetMaps, for example, and that has given us a lot of, the OSM has always played a really integral role in humanitarian response with the Hot OSM team. They've also been presented with a lot of challenges in the Ukraine context, but this isn't the first time. We've seen most of these dynamics before. Just honestly pick any underreported context in sub-Saharan Africa. That's where you would have seen this. So it usually just doesn't get the same level of press attention. So when we are trying to think about how we operate in that way, we're usually thinking about how can we apply all of these different cases, right? The kinds of things that your PhD students are taking on, and give it the urgency of the application with the boundaries of ethical application and some of that pullback of saying okay, we don't need to rush this too fast. We don't want to be, sort of shoving everything forward before it's time. But we do want to make sure that we actually put some like reality in this context so that we're not creating applications just for their own sake. I hope that was clear.
Oh, that's great. And I think it's a pretty good segue into the next topic to ask about, which is data availability. And there's no short supply of human security issues domestically, from climate security and increasing severity of natural disasters to conflicts like we're seeing in Ukraine now, or sub-Saharan Africa, as you mentioned. And in these scenarios, time to answers is critical. And geospatial projects are data intensive, and we all know that anytime you start a geospatial project, you're going to spend at least 50%, if not substantially more, just managing and dealing with and making the data work for the questions that you need to ask. So, given that, how have, in your support or execution of projects in support of human security, how have you experienced data availability or been impacted by data availability? And it'd be interesting to hear about, especially in the context of Ukraine, data trust.
In the back, we were actually just digging into this, talking about ACLED data, for example, and this is a really good use case. So, as you all know, ACLED really is based off of media. So the trust issue is always based off of that original source. Then you're getting into, first of all, who is the editor on any given story, and then who are the journalists who are reporting it, and ultimately who are the sources that they're relying on. So you're talking about trust at multiple levels. If we could do the level of vetting that we want to do on every piece that we want to do it, you would be vetting and tracking all of those things. You might notice, by the way, that the editor is not listed on all of those. They don't always get a byline. It's not always, super transparent who's covering what. It depends on the media form. Some are, sometimes, if you're doing television, the producers are much more obvious, whereas for print media, not always the case. Magazines actually go through, in some cases, much more rigorous fact-checking than other types of media. Book publishing, for example, notoriously terrible when it comes to fact-checking. Authors have to pay for their own fact-checking, or it doesn't get done. Super important to know. Not something that a lot of people necessarily know, and so you're relying on the reputation of an author and of a journalist when you're putting that forward. So you really want to check a lot of the notes carefully. And then, of course, with any given journalist, you have to go through and see what the context is for their sources and figure out not only who the source was, but what the preponderance of sources are. Are they relying predominantly on official sources, or are they actually going into the field and getting firsthand experiential sources? Are they seeing for themselves and also getting firsthand direct accounts of events that occurred? Or are they telling you what the official story is? Those are very different things. So as we break all this down, right, we can't just sort of say, okay, it's in ACLED, check, it's fine. We have to break every single layer down and then go further and then go further. We constantly fantasize about having this down to a level where we would not only be able to track to the level of any individual source so that we could actually see, is one source overly represented across multiple stories? And are we then over-representing that source's influence in our reporting, for example? That would be amazing. I would be shocked if anybody could say that they know that in their overall reporting. But if you look at any of our reports that we've put out, you will see the potential to figure that out is there, if only because the level of citation is obscene. So if anybody wants to help us with that, that'd be great. But we still have a lot of work to do before we can actually figure a lot of these questions out.
Yeah, so this issue of trust for me and our research is a little bit distinct. I'm going to talk a little bit more on the raster side of things, where we really engage with this a lot. How many of you, just to take the question out, have played with deep learning models or fit deep learning, like actually done that stuff? Oh, a lot of you, great. So you're well aware of just how much data, right, is involved. I mean, tremendous amounts of data. If you're doing it with satellite imagery, you're talking about tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of labels. As it turns out, those are actually really easy attack vectors for nefarious actors. One can corrupt those giant databases with relative ease, and even sometime on like downlinks from satellites, we worry about this corruption. So even when we're looking at satellite imagery, one of the things that we're working on is quite, again, basic research questions, but how do you detect when satellite imagery itself has been corrupted, sometimes by accident, but also potentially due to nefarious actors? And these are the types of questions I think when you're using geospatial data, right? Like when you see a picture on Google Earth, you're not sitting there wondering, oh, is that really a building? Some of my colleagues in this space as well, we've written really cool, they're called generative adversarial models. I don't know if any of you have played with DALL-E and created your own crazy pictures from words. You can do the same thing with like an urban area. You can say, make something that looks like Washington, D.C., but there's a building missing, or whatever you want to do. You can generate these things, and they can be completely made up, and you can present them as if they're real. And so how do we detect these types of things? And this is, I think this is what concerns me most right now. I think there's a lot of other concerns in the data space for sure, but the raster question is one that I think is pretty new and something that we don't have any tools to detect or deal with.
So you're just deep faking you're just deep faking all of the stuff that I got to work on.
Yes. Well, I mean, there's real concerns, right? If you're trying to establish that there was and this is something we work on in partnership with NGA, with students actually in some cases, which is going to be talked about at the next panel. But was there truly an attack on a mine? Was there truly an attack on a petroleum plant, right? These questions. We can generate satellite images that prove that that happened, but they're completely made up satellite images. And that's not hard for us to do. And that's scary, right? And so how do we mitigate that is a really big question for us right now.
Yeah. Does the building that the witnesses swear is the location where the torture took place, does it actually exist? Yeah, you're buying drinks after.
Now you're making me nervous because we often use satellite imagery to like double check some of our information. So taking a step back from this question a little bit, we're an all sources shop. Like we get weather data, we get remote sensing data, we get national statistics from other government agencies. We have staff overseas who are feeding us with information, and we use media sources as well. So we're using a variety of geospatial and non-traditionally geospatial data sets. But when it comes to trusting data, we love redundancy. We love having multiple data sets that give us similar pieces of information, similar attributes, so that we can cross-check the accuracy of the information we're looking at. It's very important to us. But when the conflict in Ukraine began back in March, we were noticing that our WMO station data was no longer reporting. The government agencies were not reporting agricultural data out of the oblasts that were in the conflict zone. So there was some data gaps there. And then the media reports, you were talking about media before, we realized it was not a reliable source of information at the beginning. There was like wild accusations coming out. Some of them were concerns about wheat production, right? And whether or not wheat exports were going to be impacted, just as one small example. And we knew that the wheat was planted months ago, and it was actually harvested in the fall, way before the conflict began. So most of that wheat had already been exported out of the country before the conflict began. So we had to very quickly, and this wasn't me personally, it was my colleague, Kata Magaki. She had to join a lot of additional meetings to talk about kind of the crop seasonality of where the crops are produced and when they're harvested and how frequently they get exported in order to tamper down some of those concerns that were seriously affecting wheat prices, right? So we were very concerned about data availability, but thankfully some of our overseas staff did stay in Ukraine. They continue to report valuable information to us. And so that was crucial for us to be able to continue doing our crop estimates. In addition to that, we partnered with NGA, we gained access to worldview imagery, and we're utilizing that high spatial resolution imagery to answer some very basic questions, but things to help try to dispel some of the rumors, if you will. So we were looking to see if, the wheat that actually went into dormancy when the conflict began, eventually it was emerging up out of the ground in the springtime and got harvested in July, actually. And so, we were double checking, are those fields still good, viable fields, or did they get destroyed in some sort of way? We're looking for that. We were looking for evidence if the farmers had been clearing the land and planting the spring crops. And then more recently, we were looking for evidence of the harvesting of both those winter and spring crops, since that happens more recently. And so, it was incredibly helpful to find this evidence in the satellite imagery that really showed the farmers were still doing their jobs. And some of them were working in areas relatively close to the conflict zone. So I was pretty impressed. And it allowed us to help temper and qualify and quantify exactly, what the crop production is about. Predominantly we were focused on wheat, corn, and sunflower seed.
Thank you. So I'm going to flip it to the other side of the coin now, and especially I'm going to start with you, Lisa. So as a government agency or representative of government agency, you have a lot of considerations over what you are going to share publicly. And so what are those when you think about releasing data into the wild, into the open, the considerations, especially for a situation like Ukraine that you have to go through and evaluate? And then I'd love to hear from the other panelists briefly as well.
Sure. We consume a lot of government and official authoritative data. And I think there's a history to this. The fact that, much of our data comes from NASA, NOAA, USGS, these space agencies, these scientific institutions, they're really good at providing official authoritative data. But somebody like an ag economist has no idea what they're looking at. They barely have any idea how to download the data. So we created a website we call Crop Explorer. And it was a way for us to organize the data by region and routinely, download it from their servers and package it and make it easily accessible. And you can find Crop Explorer even today if you're interested in crop conditions around the world. We just needed to package that data. So we prefer using global data sets from authoritative sources. That definitely makes it easier for us to cross-check a variety of pieces of information. But of course, many of these global data sets are kind of a coarse resolution of information. We have to dive in a little deeper. We gotta find some other local sources of information in order to either fill in data gaps or contextualize the information in greater specificity. And so that's when it gets a little more dicey and a little more complicated because, there's only 12 of us, official government staff in our division, and there's over 200 countries that we report on. So it's a little hard, but definitely it's the cross-checking of data and it's the long time series of data. So USDA has been publishing about trade, going back definitely to the 1960s. You can find our database all the way back to the 1960s, but technically even earlier than that. And it's that time series that helps us contextualize kind of, are conditions really super bad or just a little bad? You know, is this the best year ever? We're always looking at that time series to understand, you know, how this year compares to other more recent years. And that gives us perspective. So when it comes with wheat grown out of Ukraine, yes, the coming year is, or you know, the harvest that just happened is much lower than last year. It's about 38% lower. But for corn, it turned out to be, you know, it wasn't the bumper year of the previous year, but it turned out to be kind of average for the last few years. So it's just interesting, you know, you think this war might wipe out all of the supply, but it didn't quite do that. And, you know, thankfully, we have some resources.
So talking about releasing data, obviously for me as an academic, that's different. I wake up one morning, I think, oh, I'm going to release some data, and then I do it, right? I can do whatever I want.
We're not that fast.
Yeah. More practically, though, right, we have really fundamentally different considerations when we think about when we provide open geospatial data to the world. So one of the big projects we operate out of the GeoLab is the geoboundaries.org repository. It's the largest research database of political administrative units in the world. Community sourced, but we also work very closely with the United Nations, World Bank, and a lot of other groups. When we go to release data, because we're academics and we have time to think about silly things, things we are concerned ourselves up are, well, when we represent water bodies, how big does the water body need to be before we dissolve it into the bigger polygon? Do we represent all of the rivers and streams or only terrestrial surfaces, right? These really nitty-gritty details. Things like when we talk about data governance, who is the official representative of a country that we actually trust when they tell us what their counties are or their states are? Because you can even go to Canada and you can ask two different government agencies and they will disagree regarding what their counties are, right? I mean, in the United States, we kind of have this centralized. Everyone knows what the state of Virginia is and isn't, for the most part. Georgia and Florida might disagree periodically, but we have pretty clear lines. In much of the developed world, that's not true. And in Africa or South America, it's a complete crapshoot. And so really working through those types of problems are the types of problems we try to resolve on the academic side. Recognizing, right, in the more applied community, there's no way anyone else would ever have the time to answer these types of questions. So we try to focus on answering these more fundamental geospatial data questions, making sure we can get the most accurate data out there for fundamental data building blocks more than anything else.
So I guess there's a couple layers here. When it comes to releasing data, we start from we always have a process that we internally, we kind of run it through a few different screens. The process we refer to just as red teaming. So this is where you've got sort of your A team, your blue team, and your B team, which is red team. Red team has to be composed of individuals who have not been part of the report writing and an analytic process. So they're coming in with very fresh eyes, and they will go through the entire data set and report from top to bottom and see what alternative analyses they can come up with, essentially try to just like poke holes everywhere that they can and figure out if they can derive different conclusions, and most importantly, see if they can pull away from your results findings that would then be counterproductive for civilian protection and human security on the ground. So the other way that I can kind of think of red teaming is, it's putting on your "I'm the worst person in the world" hat for that day, and then seeing what kind of havoc you can wreak with the results that we put together with the best of intentions for civilian protection. So when we do that, and we do that with every single report that we produce, and we do that with every aspect of every piece of data, so every table, all of the data behind those tables, we have to think about how much damage can happen if we release this in this form. Because of that, we will sometimes at fairly late in the hour, right before publishing. We'll have to do things like, with a map, randomize and scramble the location points so that we are, crafting something like a heat map does not make a difference if I can reverse engineer the original points, right? If all I need to do is figure out the radius and then just work my way backwards to the center point, like that is not hard, okay? It doesn't matter how many points there are, doesn't matter if I can only get 75%, that's plenty. Like, I'll take the 25% loss if I can get 75. And that's exactly the thing that we had to do on our crop impact report, was to make sure that we randomized everything. Yeah, you probably would have noticed if you looked at it, be like, I'm pretty sure there aren't, crop production facilities in the middle of the Black Sea. You'd be right. Did we care? No, because we wanted to make sure that we were like, that was essentially also a giveaway to be like, yeah, it's off intentionally. And we weren't, we have the originals that we do produce and share for accountability mechanisms for those who need to know it and need to know it in its most accurate format. But that is not something that everybody needs to have. And it's definitely not something that we want potential perpetrators of war crimes to have. So we sometimes have, and going through a process like that is not necessarily very sophisticated. And we explain what we did. We'll explain the manipulation. Because if we did it halfway decently, it shouldn't matter that we explain how we do it. You still shouldn't be able to reverse engineer back to the original data point. I will say, when it comes to thinking also about the kind of original data that we will hold, there's also there's a few things that we also have to keep in mind. There is some data that is too sensitive for us to gather. So we will, at certain times, refuse to collect it, or simply just tell people who will offer it to us, please don't, or please go give it to that person or organization over there. They are better equipped to handle it. The fact that we are also funded by the U.S. Department of State makes a difference. So our data is accessible to the U.S. government. That person providing it may not want that to be true forever. They may be okay with that today. Would you want that to be true in 10 or 15 years? Would you want it to be true in 5 years? Think about elections and their impact on the State Department. So you kind of need to walk people through all of that, and that's always the reason why we think so hard and work on the ethics of all of this, because we have to walk people through meaningful consent process, and we're constantly bringing that up with our team. And so, yeah, it's never enough to say, okay, I've got my little checklist to walk through. Like, you have to make it meaningful for every layer, every time.
That's excellent. Thank you for talking through that. So we're pretty much at time, so I'm going to have one last question for everyone to answer. In the spirit of community and collaboration, what is one group or topic you'd love to connect with somebody later today or at the social on to make this engagement worth its weight in gold? Lisa.
Sure, thank you. For me, it'd be anyone who wants to talk about analysis-ready data. I'm happy to dive into that topic more. Definitely approaching it more from the satellite imagery side of things, but actionable data is very helpful to us. We, as an operational unit, function under very strict and quick time periods.
Workforce development, which is what everyone loves to talk about that over cocktails. We train a lot of the best and the brightest students in the world at William & Mary. It's absolutely a fantastic place to work. And one of the things that I work a lot with NGA, CIA, and DHS is how do we train students to work in a closed environment before they have a security clearance. And it's a really hard challenge, and it's really meaningful now because if you want to have access to high-resolution satellite imagery or a lot of high-resolution data sources, you really need that experience. So I'd be very happy to talk to anyone that wants to talk about some of the ways we've tried to cope with that.
Yeah, I'll echo on actionability and also interoperability. anybody who wants to geek out with me on taxonomies, categorization, ways of making those things more seamless across more data spaces, let's chat.
Awesome. And I'm going to make a plug. You've heard a lot about USA structures today. Our Oak Ridge is the lead organization making that data for FEMA. We're really excited about it. And our lead for that work, Lexi Yang, is here at this event. So would love for you all to connect with her. Also, our lead for the Landscan Open Data Portal, Aaron Myers, is here. So would love to connect on or connect you with him to learn about how we're sharing that data as well. So thank you all for your attention, and thank you to the panelists, and look forward to speaking with you all later today.